It is from work that men are rich in flocks and wealthy, and a working man is much dearer to the immortals. That's Hesiod, an ancient Greek poet, writing millennia ago. And his words, maybe surprisingly, they really set the stage for quite a deep dive today. What if, just what if, our whole modern understanding of wealth, of capital, even the act of work itself, what if it's been fundamentally off track, maybe for centuries? And what if an ancient thinker, someone writing, over 700 years before our current economic ideas really took hold, actually holds some keys? Keys to unlocking some of our most tangled, pressing modern problems, things like stubborn economic inequality or even the climate crisis.
It's a powerful thought, isn't it? And that's exactly where we're heading. We're taking a journey through this really insightful article. It's called The Bridge of Becoming: Reimagining Work and Capital Through Ibn Khaldun and Western Economic Thought, and it's by Ahmed E. Swaya. And this isn't just like lining up historical ideas side by side. It's actually a pretty profound rethink of the very foundations, the bedrock our global economic systems are built on.
Right. So our mission today, essentially, is to reimagine the role work truly plays in economic life. Foundational role. And we'll do that by digging into this comparative analysis. Yeah, Ibn Khaldun. A huge figure from Islamic civilization, but someone often, let's be honest, kind of sidelined in standard Western economics. And we're comparing him with, the heavy hitters of Western economic thought: Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Max Weber, John Maynard Keynes. And like you said, this isn't just some dusty academic thing. You should think of it more like a shortcut, maybe. A way to really grasp the fabric, the actual threads of our economic systems. And maybe most importantly, to see if there are paths towards, fairer, more sustainable, maybe just more human futures.
Exactly. And the author, Swaya, he takes a really unique approach here, quite distinct from a lot of other scholarship on Ibn Khaldun. He uses systems thinking, a framework, but not just as like an analytical tool after the fact. He uses it as a lens to see work itself as this fundamental structuring principle, a principle that doesn't just, nudge things along, but actively shapes whole civilizations, their core values, how societies actually organize themselves. It's not about finding like early drafts of modern ideas in the past.
And that's where his critical stance becomes so, eye-opening, maybe even a bit revolutionary, you could say. Because unlike so many modern economic ways of thinking, which, let's face it, overwhelmingly push capital, accumulating capital as the engine, the main measure of success, this study flips that. It deliberately centers Ibn Khaldun's perspective, which comes before the Enlightenment. And it highlights work in its broadest sense, mind you, as the original, the enduring source of all value, all production, even the very basis of moral order in society. It really turns how many of us learned economics completely upside down, challenging that gut feeling that capital has to be the starting point.
Mm-hmm. And what's really insightful is how Swaya just flat out rejects that common academic habit of seeing Ibn Khaldun as, just a trailblazer for Western economics, or just a precursor to Adam Smith. There's this narrative, right, particularly in Western scholarship, that kind of frames its own history as the natural, inevitable way things had to develop, the correct worldview. Swaya really takes that apart. He argues, pretty forcefully actually, that Ibn Khaldun's work should be seen as a genuine alternative. A different path, maybe more holistic, definitely sophisticated. It just wasn't the path adopted by the political powers that came later, especially in the West. It's not that Khaldun was like Smith 0.5. He was offering a whole different blueprint.
It's also really helpful, I think, that the author is upfront about his own viewpoint, his analytical lens for this piece. He mentions a professional background in human rights advocacy, and that shapes the rights-based perspective he brings. It affects the questions he asks, what gets emphasized. And this isn't about pushing a specific political agenda. It's more like, here's the framework I'm using transparently so you understand why the analysis focuses where it does. It helps you read it critically.
Yeah, that transparency is key. And to really get why Khaldun's thought is so distinct, you have to place him in his time. He's living, more than 2 centuries before the Western Renaissance even kicks off, way before the Enlightenment. He's a product of Islamic civilization, which, unlike the modern nation states centuries later, didn't really centralize economics in the same way. They didn't have, whole academic departments or government ministries just for the economy. So while his ideas were hugely influential in history, sociology, philosophy, his actual writings on how people make a living, how wealth is built, it's actually a relatively small part of his massive body of work. Maybe 70 pages out of multiple beams. Economic life just wasn't the single lens through which Islamic civilization viewed everything back then, which is such a stark contrast to our world today, where economics seems to drive so much. And this wider view really shaped how Ibn Khaldun saw knowledge itself. He saw it as accretive, collaborative, and collective. built up over time together.
He didn't see his own ideas as the final word, more like a small drop in his vast ocean of understanding built on what came before. And he genuinely hoped future generations would build on his work, critique it, expand it, not just repeat it or try to fit it into completely different boxes later on. It shows a real intellectual humility.
He really was humble, wasn't he? He even talked about natural and political limits to his own thinking, and suggested that readers way down the line, maybe freer from the politics of his own time, might need to read between the lines a bit. To reconstruct bits he couldn't fully spell out, I mean, that's incredibly far-sighted for any thinker, let alone someone from the 14th century. It's like inviting the future into the conversation.
Absolutely. He wasn't just writing for his own time or place, or for some specific micro or macroeconomic issue. He was thinking bigger. For everyone, really, across cultures, across geography, he thought in terms of civilizational lifespans. So his framework is naturally holistic. He looks at how concepts and practices are all interconnected, these systems interacting. He even pays attention to different kinds of energy, not just physical power, but the energy of ideas or collective will or moral purpose. He saw those as real forces shaping societies.
And his era, looking back, it really was a massive turning point in history, wasn't it? You had the decline of this major Islamic civilization and the very, very early beginnings of Western civilization's rise. And the author argues that nothing shows the contrast better than how differently they prioritized economic life and, as we'll get into, how they even defined work.
Right. So our goal here, our main aim for this deep dive is pretty crucial. First, let's try to get a solid handle on Ibn Khaldun's thought on its own terms, separate from how Western thinkers later interpreted or, claimed him. And then once we have that foundation, we can use his arguments, his insights, to really analyze and maybe critique some of the most impactful ideas from those Western thinkers who came later. Ideas that are still shaping our world, our problems today.
Okay, so we got the context, Ibn Khaldun's world, the author's angle. Let's dive right into the first big concept the article tackles, work itself. Because, well, it sounds simple, but how you define work isn't just playing with words, is it? It's like the blueprint for the whole economic house you build, or maybe misbuild.
Exactly right. The author's really careful here, distinguishing between three terms that often get, jumbled together: work, labor, and job. So first, work. The way Ibn Khaldun used it and how this study uses it is the biggest umbrella term. It's any kind of effort, physical, mental, conceptual, even systemic effort, like how a system operates that's put in to sustain something or change its state. This isn't just humans doing things. It includes natural systems operating, like, say, a river carving a valley, or societal systems like the complex machinery of government. Then there's labor. That usually means strenuous human effort, often physical. You could think of it as live work, maybe, though it can include really intense mental effort that directly changes something. And finally, job is the most specific. That's your defined role, the thing you get paid for within an organization, a formal position with compensation.
Okay, so if we take that house building idea, the whole massive project, from the architect's first sketch to the final coat of paint, that whole thing is work. The person actually laying the bricks, sweating, lifting, that's labor. And the bricklayer's official title and paycheck from the construction company, that's their job.
Got it. Yeah, you can see how blurring those could lead you down different paths when you start thinking about where value comes from.
And it's really important to get this. When many Western thinkers talk about labor, they often mean something much narrower than Ibn Khaldun's broad concept of work. This difference in definition right at the foundation, it's a key thread we need to follow, because it has knock-on effects for how we see value, wealth, how society should be structured, for everything, really.
Okay, this is where, for me, it gets really, really interesting. Ibn Khaldun, as a systems thinker, before the term was even, common currency like it is today, and this isn't just some academic label, it fundamentally shaped how he saw work and its place in the world. How did that framework influence his economic ideas? Well, you can kind of boil his systems thinking down to four core ideas, all linked together. First, any system has to be designed, or at least applied, to do something. Maintain a state, change it, or produce some outcome, what you might call an event. Second, how does the system achieve that outcome? Through doing work. Work makes things happen. Third, doing work always needs energy. Obvious for physical work, right? But also intellectual power, collective will, maybe even moral force. Energy is required. And fourth, systems work over time. Things don't happen instantly. No time, no event. Pretty logical. But then he has this crucial layer. Systems aren't isolated. They're all connected, interdependent. And critically, the energy a system needs to produce its outcome has to come from outside itself. It can't power itself internally forever. So to really understand why something happened, whether it's, an empire rising or just bread being baked, you need to identify all the systems involved. The main one setting the rules, the determinant system, the bits doing the actual work, and that essential external energy source. It's like, imagine building a bridge again.
Western thought might zero in on, say, the strength of the steel or the mix of the concrete, very specific components. But Ibn Khaldun, thinking systemically, would ask broader questions. What's the river doing? What's the bridge for in the community? What resources does the land around it offer? How will wind and weather affect it over decades? And crucially, what external forces, maybe the need for trade, the river's flow, just the passage of time, are constantly shaping its existence. He saw economies, societies, even knowledge itself as these dynamic, interconnected webs, always interacting with outside forces. And Ibn Khaldun grounds all this complex thinking in two really basic foundational ideas about, well, just being human. First, he talks about fundamental human weakness. We're created weak, born weak, we age and become weak again. This isn't like a moral failing, it's just a fact of our physical nature. And this inherent vulnerability, this kind of inescapable frailty, means we have to be social creatures. We're Madani, necessarily dependent on each other just to exist.
He even points to verses in the Quran, like Surah An-Nisa 4.28, and the human being is created weak. Or Surah Al-Rum 30.54, talking about that cycle of weakness to strength and back to weakness. It's an observation about our limits as individuals. And second, flowing directly from that weakness is the absolute necessity of work, Amal. Work isn't just, a good idea or a way to get ahead. It's essential for human life. You either have to do work yourself, or if you can't, someone else has to do work on your behalf. Which means living together socially, al-istimali insani, isn't just nice. It's fundamentally necessary for survival, for getting what we need collectively.
You really might not think about it consciously day to day, but every meal you eat, the roof over your head, the clothes you're wearing, even listening to this deep dive, it's all the end result of just countless connected acts of work stretching back, often way back. It's a huge chain of creation we usually take for granted.
Exactly. And Ibn Khaldun uses these really simple but powerful examples, like getting bread from grain. He says, look, even getting your daily nutrition from basic grain takes so much collective work. No single person can do it alone. You need the work of harvesting it, then grinding it, kneading dough, cooking it. And each step needs tools, pots, grinding stones, ovens, which means you need the work of blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, making those tools. One person just doesn't have enough ability or time to do it all. So cooperation isn't just helpful, it's literally the foundation of human survival and how we sustain ourselves together. And here's where his view gets really profound. He sees work as the original source of anything actually existing. Things exist because systems, human, natural, whatever, did work to produce them, even knowledge itself. The thing that lets humans overcome some of that inherent weakness and build civilizations, that's an outcome of work too. Parents teaching kids, mentors training apprentices, scholars researching, writing. So whatever you or I might acquire, and maybe think, I earned this through my own hard work.
Well, in Khaldun's view, it's almost always the outcome of multiple systems doing work over time, often across generations. Our existence, our wealth, it's sustained by our own work, plus the stored up work of countless others. That's a really powerful idea about how interconnected we are. Okay, so building on that foundation, Ibn Khaldun sees two main ways people get wealth or sustenance. He calls them risky and kasb. Risk is basically your subsistence, your core wealth. It's directly tied to work, usually hands-on, labor-intensive stuff, like a farmer growing food and selling it directly, or a craftsman making something and selling it. The income from risk might be limited, but it's seen as fair, praiseworthy, because it's a direct reward for the work done, the value created. Then there's kasb. This is more like supplemental wealth, acquired wealth. It comes mainly through commerce, toyara, but without the person directly doing productive work on the goods themselves. It's more about leveraging things that already exist.
Okay, so risk is direct value creation via work. Cause is more about trade. What does that mean ethically? Is trade bad then? Khaldun seems to see it as legitimate. I mean, merchants connect people, move goods, that's useful. But he flags these ethical and legal risks because the money isn't coming straight from making something, right?
That's exactly it. Take a merchant, for example. They might borrow goods or buy them cheap in one place, transport them, sell them higher somewhere else, and pocket the difference. That profit is caused. And notice this immediately challenges that common Western idea that you need a bunch of capital to even start trading. For Khaldun, trade can start small. The value comes from the work of making the connection. But like you said, that kasb income, because it's derived from price differences or timing rather than direct production, carries risks. Ethical risks, legal risks. And those risks get bigger, he thinks, especially when the profit isn't really tied to the work involved in making the goods, or when it relies on exploiting information gaps or unfair situations. This distinction gets really important when you think about how wealth has historically built up, often using the work of others, slaves, animals, even the unpaid work embedded in inherited tools or land. It raises huge questions about justice today. And this is where Ibn Khaldun brings the state, the Dawla, right into the heart of the economy, in a really central way. He argues the state actually controls the power of the market. He even calls the state al-Suq alam, the biggest market of all. Its influence is everywhere.
Whoa, hang on. Let that sink in. For Ibn Khaldun, the state isn't just like the referee blowing a whistle on the sidelines. It's the actual architect of the whole game. It designs the playing field itself.
Precisely. The state, in his view, fundamentally has the power to decide what things are worth, the rules of buying and selling, the very limits of the market. And this has massive consequences for where a civilization goes. If the state decides that accumulating wealth is more important than the value of work itself, then demand for wealth skyrockets. Society starts praising wealth above all else. But if the state values work, craftsmanship, ethical production over just getting rich, then the quality of work improves everywhere. People start valuing skill, diligence, making good things. He saw these as two very different paths with huge effects on prosperity, stability, even the moral compass of a society. And he noted that economies based heavily on trade, with those caste risks, needed strong rules. Rules against usury, riba, excessive interest, exploitative debt, and monopolies, cornering the market unfairly. He even went further. He recommended that work itself should be the universal standard, ethically and in policy, not just for pricing goods, but for judging a person's social worth, because everyone works in some way. That should be the measure. Okay, now let's put this alongside Adam Smith, often called the father of modern economics. Interestingly, they actually start from a remarkably similar place. Both Khaldun and Smith recognize that. Originally, people just met their own needs through their own work. Smith wrote it beautifully. Every man endeavors to supply by his own industry his own occasional wants. They both got that basic human starting point.
But right there, that's where the paths split. And it's a massive split, one that has totally shaped the economic world we live in now.
It really is a fundamental divergence. Because while Smith sees labor as foundational, his thinking quickly shifts. Work gets transformed into part of a system where stock, which eventually becomes capital, is presented as the real active source of creating more wealth. This capital, Smith argues, lets you generate income without having to do direct ongoing labor yourself. So for Smith, work, especially for the poor, ends up being mostly about survival, just keeping starvation at bay. It's not really seen as a path to getting genuinely wealthy. He kind of implies a laborer works because they have to, maybe only having enough food or money for a few days, so they're forced to work just to replace what they used up. Work becomes this temporary fix, something that fades in importance once you have enough capital to make money work for you. But, Smith says, once someone gets a larger stock enough saved up to live for a while, maybe even hire others, then a big economic change happens. Part of that stock can be set aside, invested. It becomes capital, a part of your wealth you expect to bring in more revenue over time. For Smith, individual labor is often just reacting to need. Capital is proactive. It's using what you already have to deliberately create future income, maybe even passive income. Accumulated wealth stock is what builds more wealth, not necessarily the ongoing act of working. But this framework leaves a pretty big question hanging, doesn't it? Where did that initial larger stock, that first chunk of capital, actually come from? And the article argues this vagueness, this lack of a clear origin story for capital, really helped pave the way for debt to become seen as normal, even essential in economics. It kind of papers over the source question, and their views on the state, also totally different. Smith really limits the state's job, provide stability, enforce contracts, administer justice, and crucially protect private property. That protection is vital, he argues, so people don't just hide their stock because they're afraid it'll be stolen or taxed away unfairly. He saw bad governments discouraging investment. So for Smith, a stable legal system is just like the necessary background noise for capital to do its thing and make everyone richer. Ibn Khaldun. He sees the state as way more active, way more central, not just a protector, but the ultimate creator and shaper of market values. The state can actually will the market's nature into being. It's a difference in kind, not just degree. Okay, as we dig deeper into the analysis, we should probably acknowledge some real challenges, things that often get missed when trying to properly engage with Ibn Khaldun's ideas today, especially from a Western perspective. One huge barrier is just getting access to his original writings. There aren't that many translations, and the ones we have were often done, without the kind of full systemic understanding of his thought that we're maybe aiming for now. So what happens is a lot of the secondary stuff written about him
especially in English, ends up being commentary on the translations, rather than a direct, subtle engagement with the original Arabic. You get layers of interpretation building up.
And what's really striking there, it's kind of a problem, isn't it, Dred, is that even scholars who are fluent in Arabic often seem to fall into this pattern of trying to make Ibn Khaldun fit into a Western box. You hear him called the first sociologist or a forerunner to Smith or Durkheim. It's almost like his whole point was just to pave the way for what came later in Europe.
Exactly. And that's problematic because it kind of assumes knowledge just marches forward in a straight line, right? That today's ideas are the peak, the truth. But that totally misses Ibn Khaldun's own view of knowledge as this accretive but fallible thing. It builds up, sure, but it's always open to error, always needs revising. And it misses his view of history as cyclical, not just linear progress. He didn't see his work as a stepping stone to Western thought. He saw it as an alternative way of thinking, a whole different path that just didn't get picked up by the powers that became dominant later. Plus, actually reading Al-Muqaddimah in Arabic is complex in itself. He revised it multiple times, adding bits, tweaking things, shifting emphasis, and he was incredibly innovative with language. He'd coin new words, revive old Arabic forms, mix in regional dialects, Berber words. He even used scientific terms from like chemistry to talk about social stuff. It makes the text incredibly rich, but also really dense and nuanced for anyone reading it today. Now, a really core conceptual difference that sets Ibn Khaldun apart from many Western thinkers is his integrated systems thinking versus their tendency to, well, analyze things more in isolation. Take David Ricardo, a giant of classical economics. He explicitly thinks in terms of isolated systems when he's talking about land rent or the value of one specific commodity like corn being traded internationally. He often assumes changes in one area won't necessarily cause big ripples elsewhere.
Right. Which leads to a big question. If you treat the economy, or even just one market, like a set of separate boxes, what crucial connections, what feedback loops do you just completely miss in the real world?
You miss the fact that everything is fundamentally connected. For instance, many Western economists back then assumed trading a single thing, like bringing in cheaper foreign corn, wouldn't really have a lasting major effect on other goods, or wages back home, or the social fabric. Ibn Khaldun, being a systems thinker, would say that's way too simple. If cheaper imported corn floods the market consistently, it has to push down the value of the more extensive domestic corn. That hits farmers, farm workers, maybe industries that supply farms. And even if both types exist, the money people save buying the cheaper corn doesn't just vanish. They spend it on something else or invest it somewhere different. That inevitably affects those other markets, those other jobs, potentially pulling capital and labor away from farming altogether. For Khaldun, all systems are linked. Input here creates output there, rippling through the whole civilization. It's a perspective that feels very relevant to understanding today's complex global supply chains and economic shocks, doesn't it? Let's go back to that central divide, the definition of work. Adam Smith, for instance, mostly confines work to human labor, direct physical or mental effort by a person, machines. For Smith, they aren't laborers. They're capital goods. They might help labor, make it more productive, amplify it, sure. But they're tools, extensions of human power, not workers themselves. This idea of work as uniquely human effort is pretty typical of that Western tradition.
Okay, so when we talk today about a robot doing labor in a factory or AI performing creative work, that's us using modern language that Adam Smith just wouldn't have framed the same way back then. The categories were different.
It's exactly. From Smith's classical viewpoint, labor is human effort, period. Ibn Khaldun's definition, though, is much, much broader, more encompassing. For him, work is any activity or intervention that sustains or changes human existence. Yes, it's uniquely human when it directly feeds into human life and consciousness, but work is also done by non-humans. Think animals plowing fields, or even natural processes like a river shaping land over centuries. The benefits of all this work ultimately flow to humans because all these systems are interconnected. And crucially for Ibn Khaldun, work becomes this generational asset. Its benefits get stored up, inherited through the results of the systems that did the work, whether it was humans directly or tools, animals, technologies used over long periods. It's that accumulated effort that builds lasting value. So the critique of Smith here is pretty deep. Yes, he sees labor as foundational, but at the same time, he sort of commodifies it, reduces it to just an input, and he downplays its long-term systemic results in favor of focusing on capital. This leads to a worldview where the human worker can end up feeling like just a cog in the machine, an instrument in a system designed mostly for production and profit. Contrast that with Ibn Khaldun. He sees work as this defining, potentially dignifying activity for everyone. It can be legitimate or illegitimate based on its ethics, its impact on other systems. He often uses the term crafts, anai,
which reflects a worldview where work is often holistic, integrated. It requires multiple skills, deep understanding to make a complete, valuable thing, not just breaking tasks down into tiny fragmented bits purely for efficiency's sake. Okay, now let's compare Ibn Khaldun with John Locke, another huge figure in Western thought, especially on ideas about labor, property, justice. Superficially, you see a similarity, right? Both seem to start from some kind of original state of nature, where doing labor gives you a right to control resources.
But hang on, there's a really radical difference hiding in there, isn't there? And this is where Ibn Khaldun offers this potent critique of modern ideas about property, a critique that feels incredibly relevant when we talk about wealth inequality or who controls resources today.
Yeah, the author makes a strong case for giving Ibn Khaldun's view more weight here. Why? Basically because his knowledge base was just more complete. Khaldun was looking back over nearly 1,000 years of ups and downs in Islamic civilization, a huge data set, effectively. Locke, writing in the 17th century, was working within the context of a Western civilization that was still emerging. His view is shaped mainly by European experience, without that deep, long-term historical perspective. So the Lockean idea, which is so fundamental to our property rights now, goes like this. God gave the earth to everyone in common. But when you mix your labor with something from nature, you make it yours. You appropriate it for your use. Locke then strongly ties this labor to private ownership of land as the main way to store that labor value. And because you have private land, you then need a coercive institution, the state, to manage it, protect it, handle disputes. Here's the massive split. Ibn Khaldun sees the outcome of the labor, the surplus produced from the land, the crops harvested, the goods crafted. That's the legitimate thing to own, not necessarily the land itself in perpetuity. For him, your right to control the land is kind of dependent on you actively, productively working it. If the work stops, the claim weakens. And you can see how this connects directly to today's issues. Locke's model, focused on land as a static store of value, required institutions for transfer and protection. Historically, this often led to huge amounts of land being controlled not by people actively working it, but by legacy wealth. Wealth built on past exploitation, like slavery, colonial land grabs, or just inheritance, disconnected from current productive effort. This raises massive ethical and practical questions about rights, resources, and historical justice that we're still grappling with. It challenges the whole idea of passive wealth just sitting there, generating more wealth indefinitely. Even David Ricardo, remember, acknowledged that labor is the foundation of all value. He even sort of implicitly recognized this stored value of past work, calling capital accumulated labor, in his big work, Principles of Political Economy.
Okay, so if even a classical guy like Ricardo kind of gets it, why? Why do Western thinkers consistently end up giving all the credit, all the glory to capital? Why does that link between past work and its stored value keep getting severed? Why is capital the hero, while the work that made it possible is just background?
The article suggests it stems from this conveniently separated definition of work and labor. Ricardo's own example of the hunter's capital shows it perfectly. He takes a hunter's spear, something the hunter made themselves, and calls it capital. Okay, fair enough in one sense. But by labeling it capital first, he immediately conceptually cuts it off from the stored work that went into making it. The time, the skill in choosing the wood, sharpening the point, balancing it, all that past labor gets obscured. And the implication? It carries through to today. Creative work, like a patent, a copyright, maybe a software algorithm that gets easily defined as capital, it can generate profit seemingly forever for the owner. But other kinds of crucial non-creative work, like building that bridge that serves everyone for generations, or maintaining essential infrastructure that often gets treated as just a cost, something consumed. The future value flowing from that past labor isn't fully recognized or compensated. This subtle but powerful conceptual split helps perpetuate inequality, allowing some forms of past work to generate endless returns, while others are effectively written off once completed. It enables exploitation where the value of the work gets detached from its long-term impact. Now, both Ibn Khaldun and many Western thinkers definitely saw a link between how an economy works and people's psychology, their character. But they saw the source of that influence very differently. For Ibn Khaldun, the effect on temperament, on ethics, on how society behaves arises organically from the repeated actions and habits within that economic system. It emerges naturally over time. Western thinkers, on the other hand, often recommended deliberate, specific actions by the state or institutions to actively mold people's psychology, like consciously trying to foster a money-making passion through education or incentives, rather than seeing it simply emerge from the system itself. Which brings us neatly to John Maynard Keynes, a huge figure in 20th century economics, massively influential globally. Keynes argued strongly that governments needed to step in to stabilize economies when they struggled. He broke decisively with that old idea of pure, hands-off free markets that would always self-correct. For Keynes, it was demand, overall spending, that really drove the economy, not just supply.
Right. And if you connect that back, this is where Keynes, writing centuries later, almost uncannily validates Ibn Khaldun's much older insights about the state's huge determining role in the economy. It's like an echo across time.
It really is.
Yeah.
Faced with the Great Depression and other major downturns, Keynes said the state should actively boost demand. How? Through government spending, public works, strategic investments, even by deliberately running up national debt if needed to get money flowing and people working. But here's the part that's really striking, maybe even a bit unsettling. Keynes suggested the state could actually create rules and limitations, structure the system in such a way as to make people addicted to the money-making passion. Why? To keep consumption high, to keep the economic engine running. The article calls this a perverse confirmation of Ibn Khaldun's assertion about the state's power as the master of markets. The state isn't just regulating, it's potentially shaping the very desires and motivations of its citizens to serve economic ends. And we see this playing out in real time, don't we? Think about the massive government responses to the 2007-2009 financial crisis, the bank bailouts, the huge stimulus packages like Air Our Day, or even more dramatically, the COVID-19 pandemic response, unprecedented levels of government relief, business loans, direct payments to citizens. These actions clearly show the state acting as a direct creator of economic conditions, often completely overriding market signals. It powerfully backs up Ibn Khaldun's theory. The state sets the rules, shapes the market, and ultimately, indirectly, even determines what gets produced and consumed. This is a world away from Adam Smith's limited night watchman state. It's also worth quickly touching on how Ibn Khaldun's cyclical theory is often understood or maybe misunderstood. A lot of scholars point to this idea of rising and falling empires as his main contribution. But the article argues that framing it just as cycles is too simple. It misses the sophistication. I mean, the basic idea of history having cycles wasn't new with him. You find it in ancient Greeks like Polybius and Plato, and Roman writers and Chinese historians too.
So it's not just about history repeating itself like a broken record.
Yeah.
Maybe Khaldun was describing something more like how complex systems, even biological ones, function, with built-in limits, processes of decay, and then transformation.
Exactly. The article suggests reframing it not just as cycles, but as tarawul, which is more like circulation or turnover of power. This actually fits really well with the modern ideas about complex adaptive systems. Societies build up institutions that work well for a time, but eventually they get rigid, stuck, ossified. This internal breakdown then creates space for renewal, often driven by new groups, maybe from the margins, or external pressures acting on the weakened system. His focus was really on those internal forces driving decline, like a ruling group losing its asabiya, its social cohesion and drive, rather than just saying history goes in circles for no reason. Understanding this internal dynamic and the state's role within it is key to grasping his larger theory of how civilizations change over long periods. It's about systemic health and decay.
Oh.
Okay, so let's try to pull the threads together now. What are the main conclusions, the big takeaways from this comparison? What might they mean for us today? One point of agreement seems to be money. Both Ibn Khaldun and the Western thinkers generally saw money as a store of value, a tool to hold economic worth over time.
Right. But here's the absolute crucial difference, isn't it? It boils down to what value money is supposed to be storing. That seemingly small difference sets off two completely different ways of thinking about the economy.
Exactly. For Ibn Khaldun, money should represent, it ought to store, the value of work. Why? Because work is the origin of everything valuable. Nothing gets made, nothing lasts, nothing changes without work being done. So work is the ultimate measure of worth for individuals and nations. And money is just a convenient way to store the surplus that work creates. Even historically, things like gold and silver, which became money, were themselves products of work, mining, refining, shaping. Contrast that sharply with modern Western thought. There, money primarily stores capital. Capital might represent wealth derived from controlling natural resources, or the abstract value of owning land, or maybe intellectual property. The focus shifts from the human effort to the accumulated asset. And Ibn Khaldun's own historical account of how economies develop really highlights this. He describes people starting with simple, direct work for their basic needs. Then they invent tools to be more efficient. Then they start using animals for heavy lifting. Then societies get organized and start using tools, animals, and even enslaved people for large-scale production. And what did all these steps consistently lead to? Surpluses of work, producing more than was immediately needed. These surpluses then had to be stored somehow either as actual goods or converted into something portable and universally accepted, like money. So from this historical logical view, money is clearly an outcome of work and the surpluses it generates. It wasn't the starting point. It was a practical solution that arose because work was productive.
Wow. Just pause on that for a second. Money as an outcome of work, not the prerequisite, not the goal itself. Our current system, the one built on those Western assumptions, basically flips that completely on its head, doesn't it? It treats capital, money, as the origin point, the thing you need before you can do anything significant, and often the ultimate purpose of the activity itself.
It's a fundamental inversion. And the article argues the primacy of work is pretty easy to see, historically, logically, practically. Work has to come before capital. Capital doesn't just magically grow on its own if you leave it in a vault. It needs work applied to it, or through it, to maintain its value, let alone increase it. Now, Western thought, with ideas like past labor stored in tools or living labor being applied now, it kind of implicitly acknowledges these stored results of work. But it never quite managed to build systems that truly enshrine work itself as the ultimate store of value. Instead, money, abstract capital, took center stage. And that, the argument goes, led us down the path to our current debt-heavy economies, where, paradoxically, some of the wealthiest institutions or nations are also the most indebted. The system becomes about making money from money, often disconnected from the real work underpinning it all. So the author identifies some really critical flaws in the assumptions made by those Enlightenment thinkers. Flaws that, he argues, have directly contributed to many of the big global problems we face now. First, industrialization and dividing labor into tiny tasks. Yes, it boosted productivity like crazy. But did it feed the world equitably? No. It led mainly to excessive production geared towards profit. This system also enabled resources to be hoarded, pulled away from other groups, even from future generations. And eventually, it made human labor struggle to compete with machines in terms of sheer output. This has had, and still has, huge impacts on inequity, both within countries and between them. Massive gaps in wealth and opportunity. Second, that core assumption that capital comes first, that it precedes labor somehow. Khaldun's framework shows this is just backward, historically and practically. Think about it simply. An employer pays an employee after the work is done. The work generates the wages, the employee's capital. The employer's capital is actually reduced by paying for the work. Work, for Ibn Khaldun, is the only truly universal equalizer. Rich or poor, everyone have to engage in work in some form to sustain themselves or their projects. Capital, by its nature, is unevenly distributed and can't achieve that fundamental equality. This might also help explain puzzling things, like why some highly developed capital-rich countries today, think Japan, Germany, are facing shrinking populations, despite high wages. This goes against classic Western predictions, that wealth always leads to population growth. It suggests those Western theories maybe missed crucial variables, focused too narrowly, leading to flawed predictions about what really constitutes societal well-being. And we have to come back to the state. From Ibn Khaldun's viewpoint, its role is just immense. He saw the state as a creator, not just a regulator. Yes, it allocates resources, it can force labor through taxes or military service, but it also creates the conceptual framework, the ethical standards, the legal rules. It even shapes what counts as rational thought, rational economic behavior within its borders.
That's a powerful thought, isn't it? If what we consider rational or efficient in the market is ultimately defined by the state, then how much of our supposed free market is actually operating freely, and how much is just playing by rules the state subtly or not so subtly put in place?
For Ibn Khaldun, there's no question. The market does not operate in a vacuum outside the state. The state wills the nature and functioning of the market, full stop. Even Max Weber, the Western sociologist, admitted that capitalism needed powerful assistance to get going and thrive. For Ibn Khaldun, that power was unequivocally the state, always. It provides the structure, the rules, even shapes the psychology needed for a certain kind of economy to dominate. So at the end of the day, we're looking at two fundamentally different worldviews, leading to two potentially very different destinies. You have the capital-centered view, dominant in the West, which pushes for maximizing wealth through more and more production, endless growth. Then you have the work-centered view, from Ibn Khaldun, which aims for increased wealth and prosperity through fair trade, exchanging well-made goods, valuing the work itself, not just chasing infinite production for its own sake. These aren't just slightly different paths. They lead to radically different places, affecting everything: society, culture, the environment, the economy, politics. Excessive production from a Khaldunian perspective doesn't lead to paradise. It leads to disaster. Climate change, resource depletion, recurring financial crises, even pandemics. And crucially, the impacts of these disasters almost always fall hardest on the most vulnerable groups in society. Ibn Khaldun also had this idea that corruption, systemic decay, injustice is basically the inevitable result when past work isn't properly valued or is actively exploited. Think slavery, unfair wages, predatory lending. But he also saw work as the potential solution, the universal equalizer. Because everyone works, recognizing and fairly compensating work could be a way to address deep-seated historical grievances, even across cultures. It's fundamental to everyone's existence.
It really forces you to think, doesn't it? What if looking back, not just forward? What if engaging with pre-Enlightenment thought, with Ibn Khaldun's worldview that puts work squarely at the center? What if that's not just history, but actually holds vital keys to tackling generational injustice, systemic exploitation, the deprivation we still see all around us?
For Ibn Khaldun, work simply is what capital became for Western thinkers.
Yeah.
It's the absolute foundation, the core unit of value, the real engine driving civilization.
Well, we started this deep dive with Hesiod's ancient words about work and wealth, and the author's final thought hits with just as much force for today. It starts with work, just like it always did. He calls it priceless work, the foundation of all value. And that is such a radical challenge to our current worldview, isn't it? A worldview that puts capital, abstract money, right at the very center, treating it as both the starting point and the ultimate goal of all our work.
So, if this modern worldview, the one that's given us amazing successes, yes, but also our persistent failures, our financial crashes, our climate emergency, our deep inequities, if that's led us here, what could the future possibly look like if we seriously considered Ibn Khaldun's worldview? How would we even define success and failure differently in a world that truly prioritized work as the origin, the sustainer of everything valuable? What kind of systems, what kind of society might emerge if work, not capital, was recognized as the real cornerstone of value and human flourishing?
That's definitely something profound to chew on long after this deep dive wraps up. What stands out most to you listening? How might Ibn Khaldun's perspective make you rethink work, wealth, and maybe even the kind of future we're building?